And now open your eyes and wiggle your toes. And before we get into talking about how to survive, I'd like to tell you a story about a preacher who was driving down the street, and there was a cop that was watching his car, and he saw the preacher kind of waving down the road, so he pulled him over and said, "Pastor, you've been drinking." And the preacher says, "Why, no, officer, I don't really drink much." He said, "Well, I need to see that container on your dash there. Can you show it to me?" So he said, "Sure." Gave him said, "What's in there?" "Just water, sir." So he gave him the container, and the officer opened it up, and he said, "Preacher, there's wine in here." Puts the top back on and hands it back to the preacher, and the preacher goes, "Thank you, Lord, you've done it again." So he found his way out of a tough situation, and although that was humorous, there's a message there that it's not as hard sometimes as it seems to find better answers. He was pretty quick on his feet, and we can be too. Today, we do face challenges of COVID. We're dealing with sick family members or friends, and we even see unparalleled political discord in this country, things we never thought would happen. And sometimes we see discord even with our own family, and we have to put up with it. And we're asking ourselves in a lot of cases, for all of these, when the heck is this going to end? And psychologists now say that many of us have experienced PTSD, surprisingly, because of the things we've gone through with COVID. And we think about it and we say, wait a minute, that's just for soldiers. But it's not. Whenever we're into situations where we're troubled greatly and we don't see the end, sometimes it's easy to develop that kind of a reaction, PTSD. But as we think about it, we need to find times to get out of these long-term concern situations. And we have to learn how to believe that we'll get through it. We have people, sometimes it's us, and we have feelings of despair, sadness, and worry. How many of us have that or have had that experience? Almost all of us, me included. The Bible has many stories about when Jesus was troubled. He found places of solitude and spent private time praying and asking God for direction. In Mark 1:35, it says, "In the morning, before everybody else got up, he rose and went out to a lonely place to pray." Charles Stanley, who is the father of Andy Stanley, another famous preacher, said, "As you walk through the valley of the unknown, you will find the footprints of Jesus both in front of you and beside you. He's always there to help us." Stanley also said, "God sometimes demonstrates his faithfulness in adversity by providing us what we need to survive. We may not realize that God has given us the tools and the wisdom to survive almost anything, because it's really hard when you feel the weight of the world on your shoulders. And Reverend Stanley is telling us that God does not change our painful circumstances, but he does sustain us through them. Some problems don't usually fix themselves. That what we need to do is solve our own problems, and with God's help, we can. What Stanley meant was that God has our back He gives us the tools and the opportunity to not only survive unpleasant things, but to learn from them. Learning from the lessons of surviving tough times is very important. Sometimes we have to go through challenging situations because God is not only helping us learn how to do that, but He is helping us learn that we can do it. We can solve our own problems, and the problems don't seem to be as tough as we think when we've gone through some of those things. And in the future, when we are faced with a similar problem, it's much easier when we can say, hey, this is similar to the problem I faced last year. I can do this thing. The other thing we learn as we solve problems is that when we come out of the other side of darkness, as we look back and think about when you have had, look in your past, think about problems that you had that were pretty severe and you were troubled by them. And today, when you look at that same problem, you say to yourself, that really isn't as hard as I thought it was going to be back then. And that's usually the way it is. That hope sometimes can sustain us as we're trying to get out of these things. And generally, when we get into these problems, we ask ourselves if the old saying is true, this too shall pass. I know I've been there, and I'm sure all of you have been there too. As I think back on my darkest days and evaluates the problems I was facing, I can see things in a much different light. And the old saying is true, but bridging that gap can be a psychological challenge. In Unity, we're taught that the kingdom of God is within us. We're also taught that we're not an accident. We were made in God's image. We're deliberately planned and given our own unique gifts. If we remember these things, we have to feel special. And when we do feel that weight of the world on our shoulders, knowing that we are special and we do have special talents, it helps us think that if I'm that special, I should be able to find a solution to this. So, problems that we have today might seem really big, but another thing we can do is change the way we're looking at things. And right now, take a minute and think of 5 things that you're especially blessed to have. This would be the same thing we did during meditation. But think about those for a minute and think about how blessed you really are. We each have those things, and it helps to change the view. And often in the past, you've heard that saying that when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And I think I'm the student here. I was going to South Carolina several weeks ago to visit friends, and when I got to the Grand Rapids airport, I got there early. And I planned to work on the sermon during the flight, but I wasn't sure on all the things I should say or didn't have a lot of good examples, and so I was kind of searching. And I had extra time, so I went into the store where they sell magazines and chewing gum and that sort of thing, and lots of books. And for some reason, I was drawn to an obscure corner where there was a circular book rack. And when I came close, I saw a small book. It says, "What the Bible Says About Dealing with Difficult Times." And it has some great messages in here, and some of which we'll talk about today. You know, was this another coincidence? I think not. This time the student was ready. And it's like we talked about in the past as a God wink, which is things that might happen and seem like a coincidence, but we really can see divine guidance in action. An important thing we need to do is keep things in perspective. Sometimes we do need to change the view, and it's easy to think you have the only problem in the world that's this bad. Nobody else has got to be feeling the pain that I'm feeling. And if you're feeling sorry for yourself or just overwhelmed, stop and think of a friend who has a special need or a big problem or something she just can't seem to solve. Spend time with that person and be a sounding board and a source of comfort and information. Just as when your blessings, as you thought about on your blessings, it's tough to feel sorry for yourself when you're helping others. It does wonders. When you think about things like that, just remember the talents that God gave you. You've got special talents. You are special. You're made in His image. And with that, we should be able to think about how much we can help other people. And that's really helping ourselves. When God gave us a challenge that we can't seem to solve, we have to think that we have to listen because He's telling us how to solve the problem. The challenge is we have to learn to hear Him. He's speaking to us all the time. Most of us, me included, aren't listening, and we don't hear all these things. And my wife could, and I never could, and I'm a little better now, but it's gotten, I think that women are more sensitive to that kind of thing than men are, so I would urge all men to be thinking, Jennifer's nodding her head, yep. But whether you're a guy or gal, I think we have to go into our quiet place. And if we do this, we're going to be better at hearing what God's advice is. His answers for us are always out there. And His answers may come in strange ways. They may be while you're in the shower, you get an idea. It may be a little book you just happen to see, or a chance comment from a friend. God does talk to us, but it's up to us to listen. In Luke, we're reminded how Jesus sought answers from God when He went to the mountain to pray. This was His way to listen for God's direction. Another thing we can do is remember that God always is controlled and He always has our back. Bruce Wilkinson, who is a Christian teacher and author of a book called Tap into Your Own Potential. It's a great book. The thing he says in there is that in my experience, God is rarely makes our fear disappear. Instead, He asks us to be strong, take courage, and act. God gives us the tools. Our job is to be able to recognize those tools and to use them. One of these tools is having faith in yourself. That is really important. But faith in yourself, knowing with God's help, there's almost no problem you can't solve. Having faith in yourself really is your own superpower, because if you can get your own mind out of the way, not worry about, I'm not sure I can do this, you can spend time concentrating on the problem at hand. And it's amazing how often that answers do seem to come to us. Sometimes we don't think about them. We don't give them the weight that they need to have. You know, we don't know if they're just a crazy idea we had. And God has given us the talents that listen to these things and the talents to understand how to take them and solve our own problems. We just have to think about how strong we are and that we can do this. And you will see the answers. It's always important, also important to never abandon hope. Sometimes you're looking for answers and, damn it, they just don't seem to come, or I haven't gotten the idea that I need. And one of the things Henry Ford is famous for is his advice to think you can or think you can't. Either way, you're right. So if you're convinced that you can solve the problem that you've got, then you will be able to do that. And with God's help, this should be absolutely no thing that we couldn't solve. It depends on how strong our faith is, how strong our faith in God is, and how strong our faith in ourselves is. If we have faith ourselves, or if we don't, when we question that, we have to remember that we're made in God's image and that the kingdom of God is within us. How much more powerful could we be? How much easier should it be to solve problems with that inside of us? And as we think about this, when things don't happen to work, it doesn't mean that we're not getting closer. It doesn't mean that we don't have the answer. We just have to be patient. The answers are around us, and sometimes we just have to keep looking, but they'll be there. We have to think about those special powers that God gave us and believe that they'll come, because they will. Next thing that we have to do is it's really, really, really important to make peace with your past. And even though we know we can't change the past, many of us, including me, sometimes continue to invest energy in worrying about the unfairness of yesterday, or how we could have or should have done different things. Since we can't change the past, why should we be concentrating on that? We should be concentrating on the positive lessons for today, that if we study the past, if we study what happened yesterday, it can be very painful. But there's a lesson in there that helps us learn how to do better today, how to profit from the experiences. Profit can mean financial, but it's also profit in the way you feel and the way you approach things. But profit from the experiences of the past and take advantages of the opportunities that are available today, because we have figured out the answer to the problem. The question is, do you invest more time than you should in living in the past? Are you troubled by feelings of anger? We all still are there, I think. But do you have bitterness, envy, regret? Do you harbor ill will towards somebody that you just can't seem to forget and forgive? If so, it's time to get serious about putting the past behind you. Then you'll be able to concentrate on the problems of today, and you'll find that you actually like yourself better because you're not thinking all those negative thoughts. Perhaps there's something that you need to that you had in your past that was a regret, deep regret, or maybe you had been scarred by trauma that you simply can't resolve. Now it's time to ask for God's help. Sincerely, prayerfully, and often, as you decide once and for all, you're going to move past that pain in the past and think more about today. When I think about my own past, I think about stuff I could have done much better, or even situations about which I might be embarrassed. And I look at the situation and I first ask myself, did I do the best I can? Really ask myself three questions. Did I ask myself, did I do the best that I could under those circumstances? And with the knowledge I had at the time, not the knowledge I have today, but the knowledge I had at the time. And did I ever act with malice in my heart? If the answer was yes to all three questions, I knew I did the best that I could, and I shouldn't beat myself up because of that. I gave up feeling guilty a long time ago about things I did in my past if I acted with love in my heart at the time. For the most part, I've forgiven myself for not being the better person I could have been if I had applied today's knowledge to what happened back then. But that sounds kind of stupid because none of us can do that. So we need to think about today. And as we make peace with our past and we forgive ourselves for everything from the past that troubles us, we also need to remember to forgive everybody else that we might have thought about or had problems with in our past. Forgive everybody. Don't waste time thinking about those painful experiences because they're not going to get any better. You can't go back and fix them. So if we just don't worry about them anymore, we'll all feel a lot better inside. George Buttrick, who was an Englishman, and he was a respected preacher in the early 20th century, said, God does not wish us to remember that which he is willing to forget. So why should we? Sometimes it's not easy to forget people that have hurt us. But when we forgive everyone for everything in our past, it's much easier to solve today's problems because, as we talked about, we can then concentrate just on those. We don't have to be thinking about how could I do this, and can't. It's in the past. One other thing helps us, and that's to avoid the pitfalls of procrastination. And I don't know about you, but I got a lot of things I procrastinate about. And I have to forgive myself for procrastinating because I do. There's things that I know I need to do, but I just don't want to do them. And when God gives us answers, it's sometimes hard to implement them. We might have to take actions that are uncomfortable or sometimes painful. But if we don't, the reactions to what happened in the past will continue to fester. It might even seem to get bigger. And one of the other things I found was a great book, and I would recommend anybody read it. It's called The 5-Second Rule. And in this book, it says that the way the author discovered how to end her procrastination was to do things that she saw happen at NASA when she worked there. And she said she learned a lot when she realized, when she watched the rocket go up and they counted backwards, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, liftoff. And she changed that to say, start taking action. And she talks about all the things that she had been putting off, and that when she did that, it's just like she had a hard time getting out of bed. She always hit the snooze button. And so she just started counting down, and when that happened, she turned off the alarm and got up And it's just a trick to help yourself accomplish things and not do as much procrastination. I found it helpful for me in a lot of ways. And the subtitle of this book is really accurate. It says, "Transfer Your Life and Confidence with Everyday Courage." The reason why something like that is important is because we have to do things that we feel good about. And most people, if you're procrastinating, you're going to be worried about that. And so we need to get rid of that. So that's another thing that helps us, because if we're not feeling guilty, we can be better at solving our own problem. And one of the things that's very interesting is there was a study at Harvard, and they talked about this, and they found out that there was something called the progress principle. And that is that if you start making progress, small progress, you start moving in a different direction. You're happier, you're feeling more like you can do this. And so it's really important that we just get started. And that's where this book comes in, and it's got some great things in there. But it does boosts our mood and increases our happiness. Then the author comes back and says, when you think about your problems, you will either find a way to solve them, or you'll find an excuse. Which will you do? When we start taking actions, things will start to improve. But as we talked about a minute ago, we also need to be patient. But sometimes they aren't as fast as we think. In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we learn that Jesus found his answers on the mountain. Now, the mountain is just places of prayer, places of revelation, places where we can find healing and answers. So ask yourself, where is your mountain? Where do you go when you need some answers to pray? Someplace where it's quiet and you can listen for God's answers. In closing, I'd like to share two more things with you. First is a quote from Winnie the Pooh. Get a little more updated here. And as you know, this is a child's book, but it contains a lot of things in there that adults really should internalize. And it is especially important that we talk about how to survive, but a lot of things in there are addressing this same subject. As Christopher Robin told Winnie the Pooh, you are braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, and smarter than you think. Or, said another way, there will always be someone who can't see your worth. Just don't let it be you. And the last thing is a quote from Peter Marshall. He puts everything in the right perspective. He says, Lord, when we're wrong, make us willing to change. And when we are right, make us easy to live with. If you found any of those ideas helpful, I've got a summary that I'll put in the newsletter, and I'll also tell you about the books if those are helpful. Have a great week.